I totally agree that our way of thinking is something that we should tackle first, and that will make a big difference moving forward. And Nika, same question for you.
Thanks, Ryan. So a report came out a few years ago that said that we can't actually get to 1.5 degrees of warming without addressing the cause of animal agriculture. And when we talk about 1.5 degrees of warming, that's the level that world leaders agreed to back in 2015 at the climate change conferences, that if we try to limit global warming to that extent, we'll avoid some of the most disastrous floods and forest fires. Although we're already seeing 1.1 degrees of warming, and in some places around the world, in Canada actually, we're already experiencing warming higher than some other regions. And so without addressing animal agriculture, we simply can't get to the goals that we set. And now we need to really hold leaders accountable that you committed to getting us to 1.5, and without including reduction of animal agriculture in your plans, we can't get there. And so I think that's just such a critical piece to remind environmentalists as well, that if we don't address meat and dairy production, we're not going to get there. Beyond just the climate change impacts, which we've talked about a bit, there's other negative impacts of animal agriculture, from water use to land use. We talked about efficiencies. And so there's just so much positive impact we can have by reducing animal agriculture on this planet, and it's about time that it gets addressed. And I'm excited to talk about some of the challenges in getting there and some of the solutions.
Thank you so much, Nika, for sharing that perspective. And now I want to hop into some questions I have for each of you. So I think we'll go in reverse order. So Nika, I'm wondering, you're the Executive Director of Youth Climate Safe Canada, the Canadian branch of the first youth-led climate action group focusing directly on food systems and climate change. And you're also a policy analyst for Environment and Climate Change Canada. Could you expand a bit on your work in both of these roles and talk a little bit about any generational differences you've noticed in your work in these spaces?
For sure, thanks Ryan. So my role as Executive Director of Youth Climate Change Canada, so what we do is we focus a lot on systems level change and policy change related to food and climate change. So we focus on animal agriculture, but we also focus on food waste, and we focus on other issues related to food. So we try to take a broader perspective, but in any time we can, we do try to really talk about animal agriculture as one of the biggest things, in addition to reducing food waste, that we can do for the environment. And some of the work we did last year, and Ryan did this with me actually, is we talked to members of parliament. So we met with over 20 members of parliament from across Canada, different ridings, and we just educated them on what youth know about food and climate change and why this is an important topic for them to take action on. And our call to action for them was just to educate themselves. We gave them documentaries to watch. We encouraged them to look at the plant-based treaty as a solution. And those meetings one-on-one with these members of parliament were really beneficial in helping us raise the awareness of this issue and how important it is and how much of a priority it is. Other work we do with Youth Climate Save is we try to push default veg campaigns. So we did a campaign for the Globe Forum. So the Globe Forum is this large climate related conference that happens in Canada every year, and it's attended by a lot of top business professionals, and we did a campaign to make the food there default plant-based. We also do campaigns like that for other conferences, and we're also part of the team for the Climate Change Conference in Dubai in November, COP28, and along with ProVeg, we signed on to a letter to get 75% of the food at the climate conference to be plant-based, and so that's an initiative that we're working on with Youth Climate Save. In my other job, I'm a policy analyst with the federal government, and so what I do there is not related directly to any of this work at all, but I work on a regulation for coal mining, and we're trying to limit the amount of selenium and nitrate in the water that comes from these coal mines. And so my background, education-wise, is international affairs and public policy, and so that is what I do at my job, and then I do Youth Climate Save as well. So getting into your question about generational differences, this was a really great question, and I was tempted at first to think about, well, you know, youth are more open-minded and older people are not, but I realized that's really not it at all. And there's a few specific things that I want to talk about with that. One is social media use, and so I would say that talking to youth, and I want to be talking about what it's like just talking to the general public, not necessarily environmentalists. We can get into that a little later. But just talking to the general public youth that have heard about climate change, they're using social media. What I've found is that they tend to take one perspective and then just stay within that perspective and continue to consume content that reinforces the core beliefs they have. And although this can happen at any age, I find that youth don't necessarily read the news as much, and they don't really have a diverse array of sources of information. And so when they see like a 15 to 20 second clip about something, they can tend to just take that as fact and then continue to consume content that reinforces that perspective. So for example, if they see a clip from a Joe Rogan podcast that's talking about all of the animals that are killed in these plant-based farms, like the bees and the rodents, or I don't fully know that full argument, but that's like one of the arguments against veganism. They might tend to continue to consume content like that and then believe that it's actually not a solution to have plant-based food. And so I find that sometimes youth are a bit harder to change their mind because they've consumed a lot of content and information that reinforces one belief system. On the other hand, I find talking to adults or older generations, they tend to be a bit more open-minded. Even if they consume one type of news source, they do still hear news from other sources, and I think they tend to have a bit more of a balanced perspective. And so I think that is some of the generational difference, is really in terms of how do they get the information they're consuming about the environmental effects of animal agriculture. And then secondly, I think the type of activism that appeals to different generations is a little bit different as well, but also similar. So I think in our work, we saw that the default veg approach was one of the most productive ways of activism. And basically what default veg means is you go into a conference or an event and the food is just default plant-based, and it was never mentioned that it was, like it's just kind of what it is. And if you wanted to not have a plant-based option, you could indicate that as like a restriction in your registration form. And so when this is done, they see that I think it was a 40 to 80% increase of people consuming plant-based food, and it's kind of like not even making it a choice for people to have to think about like, oh, this is more environmentally friendly. And then what I wanted to say about that as well is the environmental impact of food is still not a top thing that affects people's choices when it comes to food. Unfortunately, it is still taste and habit and also availability that affects what people choose in a moment to consume. And so that's why we've seen in our activism, the type of activism that appeals to people is just making it the default and then explaining to them later why that was the default, rather than trying to just explain all of the facts. And that's kind of, just the narrative around that is something that I think appeals to both generations. So I hope that answered your question.
It certainly does. Thanks so much for sharing. And I think it's interesting how you talked about it. I think a lot of people agree. I agree with you.